There's nothing you can do. If they've got your email, if they've got your phone number, they can get your life and they can hack you. When that sinks in, that is incredibly chilling.
Do you have a bank account? Do you have an identity? Both of those things are valuable to an attacker. It happens to everybody.
Everyone is at risk from ransomware, really.
We just went through a pandemic where the whole world was affected by this virus. The whole world can be affected by a cyber attack virus as well.
You need to have policies and procedures in place of what to do. Unfortunately, it's not a matter of if, it's more a matter of when.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caught in the Digital Crosshairs. We're coming to you at a very critical time for the world. You have wars in Ukraine and the Middle East that dominate the news. You have new technologies such as generative AI that create both the potential for promise and peril. We have disinformation, we have polarization that threaten democracies around the world. But beyond the kinetic threats of warfare, we have threats that often go unseen. Cyber attacks, cyber crimes that affect governments, that affect citizens, that affect societies, and billions of dollars are lost each year. Precious data can be compromised, and in some cases, there can be real-world human consequences. I have a really esteemed panel here to discuss this sobering landscape, but to really illuminate the landscape and help illuminate a path forward. And so I'm going to introduce our guests in turn. Kaja Ciglic, Senior Director of Digital Diplomacy at Microsoft, Stephane Duguin, CEO of the CyberPeace Institute, Bonnie Leff, Senior Vice President of Corporate Security at Mastercard, and David Haigh, a human rights attorney. Now, David, we're going to hear a bit of your story and a bit of really harrowing personal story in a little bit. But before we do that, before we dive in, I want our viewers to get a sense of the scope of what it is that we're talking about. So Kaja, let me have you kick off the conversation for us. Give us the big picture. What does the threat landscape look like from your perspective?
Thank you. So, you know, a little bit like the video at the beginning said, I think cybersecurity is the defining challenge of our time. Whether we look at cyber warfare and, you know, whether you look at situation in Ukraine over the last couple of years or what is developing in the Middle East today, both from cyber attack and sort of disinformation, misinformation perspective, those are both harrowing examples of what can happen and how people can use technology to manipulate others into actions. Similarly, we see an increased number of states in peacetime, not just in times of war, in investing in cyber offensive operations. We see more and more activity around cyber espionage, and then critical infrastructure also remains a core target, whether it's education sector, energy sector, healthcare sector, as sort of we also explored as part of this series. In addition to that, there's also just traditional cyber criminals. You know, well-resourced cybercrime syndicates continue to grow and evolve. They continue to adapt and find ways to overcome security measures that individuals and organizations have put in place. And just the challenge is just growing. At the same time, we're also finding more and more this is becoming a business. So we are seeing private sector enterprises that effectively are selling services, products that allow their customers to break into, whether it's a personal account, whether it's into organization's account, sort of. And so the cyber mercenary market that is also emerging is also a very strong concern for Microsoft.
Kaja, thank you so much. Stephane, let me bring you into the conversation. And again, just to put sort of the same big picture question to you, tell us about the scope and the impact of cyber attacks today. Give us a sense of the threat landscape from your perspective.
Thank you. And building on what Kaja was mentioning just before, you can really look into the convergence of the worst, meaning that you have a huge part of cyber attacks, cyber operations, which are conducted for financial gain. So this is still like old school cyber criminal modus operandi, going for money, but in a way that is highly sophisticated. Because it could be by launching very large scale campaigns of attacks against the most vulnerable. You end up clicking on something you should not click on, open the attachment that you should not do. And because of the magnitude of the attacks, you can end up being a victim that the attacker was not even foreseeing to be. So that's on one end. On the other end, it can be very targeted, like the big game hunting of some specific group, like ransomware, going into companies in order, to make big impact and getting quite a huge gain when it comes to this. On the other hand, you have all the activities that are or performed directly by state actors, or sponsored by state actors, or facilitated by state actors. So imagine that you're in a situation where, as a victim, as a target, you're facing criminals with a financial motive. You are facing states with a need for geopolitical advantage or gain, and all of that, and we have seen this on escalation since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, is now fueled by more loose communities of attackers, like hacktivism or whatever you want to call it. But basically, people are partaking, a cause, an intent to conduct attack in a very decentralized way against specific targets. Like we see a collective since the invasion of Ukraine, but we see this very recently exactly the same modus operandi after Hamas attack and Israel bombing of Gaza. So it's quite a complicated threat landscape and very hard as vulnerable community to navigate.
Let me just stick with you for 1 second. So you just mentioned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and your organization has been tracking an increase in cyber attacks on humanitarian organizations since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Explain that trend for us.
We started monitoring what was happening in cyberspace after the invasion of 2022. We could see that not only there's an escalation in terms of numbers of attacks, but also an escalation into numbers of threat actors. So in June this year, we could track and monitor the activities of more than 100 threat actors where activities are directly linked to the conflict. So you have, threat-sponsored actors, you have criminal groups, as you know, who took like public stances into supporting one side or the other. But you also have, I was mentioning this before, and loosely groups that are called on Telegram channel and other platforms to participate to large-scale cyber attacks, such as denial of services. This is happening quite a lot. So interestingly, since the 2022 invasion, nor the Federation of Russia nor Ukraine are the most targeted by the cyber attack. We have 53 countries in the world targeted by these attacks across 23 sectors of critical infrastructure or essential services. So that's how you see escalation. At the end of the day, you end up having civilians who cannot benefit from essential services because of what has been escalated into another part of the world.
Thank you, Stephane. Bonnie, let me bring you into the conversation. So you said earlier this year that cybersecurity for NGOs or non-governmental organizations, you said that issue or that problem has kind of been off of people's radar screens for some time. Why is that the case? Why has that topic been off of people's radar screens? And what do you think accounts for this uptick in attacks that Stephane was just noting right now?
I think the uptick, Stephane talked about it a little bit in terms of the attractiveness of NGOs in terms of being a target, whether it's for hacktivists or for state-sponsored actors. And I think that NGOs really have a lot of valuable information. Similar to for-profit companies, they have confidential social profile data, they have donor information, so they are attractive to a lot of groups of people. They have the beneficiary information, so again, they have those same needs to protect this information, which can be challenging. I think in terms of the increase of attacks as well, similar to other industries, they've had the same digital transformation, right? So the increase in the attack surface has really grown in terms of the amount of area they have to protect. Similar to the private sector, we've seen an increase in the digital transformation. That's a natural evolution, and the increase in the attack surface. So there's really more areas that we have to protect. But what's been even more acute really here is for the NGOs, and why they're really more at risk is that they have a lack of cyber knowledge. So there is, a war to try to get cyber talent. That is something that's been well documented across the world, across every industry. And this is something that is more challenging for an NGO, which is under-resourced, can't really fight for this talent. And so it's even more at risk, and it can't use its resources to really prioritize basic cyber hygiene and really be able to protect itself.
Thanks, Bonnie. Kaja, let me bring you back into the conversation. So you gave us sort of a big picture overview at the outset. You've heard a few comments by other folks on the panel. Let's zoom in. Who actually is perpetrating the attacks that we've been discussing so far? Is it state actors who are at fault? Is it rogue criminals? Is it mercenaries? All of the above. But give us a sense of who's actually engaging in this activity.
And I wish I could have like a super simple answer. I actually do. It's all of the above. But I think so. But so I would say the vast majority of attacks are still perpetrated by cyber criminals across the board. It's just that they are much more organized. There's definitely an emerging sort of almost a distribution of labor across the different actor groups. Like if you look at ransomware, there are people who write the ransomware code. There are people who identify the targets. There are people who deliver the code, and these are distinct groups that they're working together. So it's becoming much more of a effectively organized crime network. There, in addition to all the ones we mentioned earlier, there are hacktivists. So the people who have a distinct political or social agenda they want to land. They often conduct distributed denial of service attacks, so the defacing websites, things like that. Think Anonymous as an example. They also do hack and leak operations, so hack a particular group or a government, leak information to drive a particular change in policy, let's say. There's also still individuals. There is still this image of a guy in a cellar. I think that still exists. That is still out there. I think, but we are seeing increased amounts of activity by states. I think the reason why, or state-affiliated actors, the reason why there's a lot more attention to those is because they tend to be much more sophisticated attacks that with potentially much greater consequences. Not to belittle, an organization or the impact on an organization that gets attacked and its data gets stolen, but the possibility of a state actor hiding on critical infrastructure in a country for potentially long periods of time, either spying or just being pre-positioned in case there's a crisis later on down the road where they could potentially turn off the critical infrastructure. I think that's driving a lot of the concern and a lot of, rightly so, in terms of what can those actors actually do if a crisis erupts, for example.
Kaja, thank you for rounding up the first part of our conversation. I think we have a reasonably good sense of the threat landscape, and I now want to shift into, for our audience, I want to dive into some real-world examples of cyber attacks. And throughout October, which was Cybersecurity Awareness Month, GZERO Media here at Eurasia Group partnered with Microsoft and the CyberPeace Institute to produce a series of videos illuminating particular real-world cyber threats. And one of them that I want to focus on today is spyware, involving the case of human rights attorney David Haigh. Now, David, just before getting to your story, you were the first citizen of the United Kingdom confirmed to have been targeted by Pegasus spyware. And for those watching who don't know, Pegasus spyware, it's designed to be installed quite covertly on mobile phones and essentially can track just about any activity that you conduct online. So David, just tell us, this is a fascinating story and a harrowing one, of course. How did you discover that you were being targeted by the spyware, and why do you think you were targeted?
I mean, yeah, it's certainly not a first that I think anyone would want to have their name attached to the first Brit to be hacked by military spyware. I mean, it was spring of 2021, and I'm a human rights lawyer. I was working on a number of human rights cases. One of the ones that I was working on just happened to be a princess. I say that because some people think that, when they listen to my story, it will never happen to us because we don't work with princesses. But it's not the case. So I was contacted by a newspaper called The Guardian, and we had a long relationship with them, but it was very cloak and dagger. They were like, "We have something to tell you, but we can't tell you over the phone." So, and it was going backwards and forwards with them. So we met them in London, and they said that, again, they didn't say the word Pegasus. They said, "You've got a cybersecurity issue. Can we have your telephones to check?" Now, as most people that, newspaper comes up to, particularly the type of work that we were doing, and at the time I was in secret contact with a hostage princess, I'm not going to hand my phones over to a newspaper, even if it was one that you might trust a little bit more than the others. So in the end, they basically said, "Okay, we'll put you in touch with Amnesty Tech," and then Amnesty basically took a copy of my phone, my iPhone, and about an hour or so later, with some glee I might add, it wasn't replicated for me, said that we found evidence of Pegasus. And then I said, "Well, what's that?" Because obviously Pegasus, you think of the Greek mythology and everything. And then they said, well, it's the best kind of evidence that we've managed to find so far. You're the first Brit that it's been on. We think you were targeted because of the work that you were doing for a lady called Princess Latifah, who is the daughter of the ruler of Dubai, who I'd helped escape and campaigning for her freedom. And at the same time, I was also helping a lady called Princess Haigh, who was the daughter of the former King of Jordan, who was in a big divorce in England. But like I said, take away the fact that these people are princesses, and you've got someone who was abused by their father, you've got a woman who was seeking custody of her children and had fled her husband. And they were, the lawyers, Princess Haigh, they were all hacked. So, we were part of this group of people that has now been found by the UK courts to have been hacked by Pegasus by the regime in Dubai. So that's how I was told. And I've worked in big corporations, big law firms. I've worked in football, so I'd always liked to think that I was kind of hacking aware, as you might say. So kind of changing passwords regularly, things like that. But when I was told about Pegasus and I was told about what this thing can do, none of that matters, because if they've got your telephone number, they've got your email address, they've got everything. And it was the realization that actually exists. And yes, this might be a government, but if governments have got it, I'm sure others have, whether it's corporations or cyber mercenaries, as you mentioned, or all sorts of people. If that technology exists somewhere, it exists everywhere. And that's the thing that I found terrifying at the time. And the more I learned about it, the more terrified I got.
David, let me just stick with you for a second. I mean, how did this incident affect you? What were the consequences? It's a really harrowing account.
I mean, even now. I mean, even the other day, I'm always now super aware of things, and I'm working on quite a high-profile thing at the moment, and so if something happens, or if you're you're talking to someone that you're helping abroad, and all of a sudden something makes you think, you become very paranoid, so you think that maybe you're being listened to again. So the other day I changed my passwords, and I don't know how many you've got things like Netflix logins and this login and that login, and once you change one password, it's even just, I mean, I'm trying not to kind of simplify it too much, but because even just changing passwords is difficult in the world that we're in. But the implications of what that happened to me, I mean, from not just me, but I remember when it happened as well, it was almost kind of like you were infected with something that other people can catch, because my friends would say to me, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry to hear about that. You must feel bad." And then the next question after an awkward pause is, "Do they know who your friends are?" And you kind of, it's jokey, but people are thinking that, because if these people have got into your private life, into your financial information, into your emails, into your pictures with your loved ones, whatever it may be, your shopping list, whatever it may be, your Alexa or Google Earth, whatever, all these other ones that there are, then they could be in your friends, they could be in your husbands, your wives, boyfriend, girlfriend, your families, where does it end? And that was, that is a very good question. If they've hacked you, can they have hacked other people through you? And that was one of the big impacts for me, was I started to worry about other people, because even now, after I was targeted with Pegasus, and I was also targeted with another spyware through spearphishing through email, and there's no, certainly in England, there's no, we brought it to the police, we did all these things, there's no kind of agency that helped you. The police have no clue. I contacted Apple, the iPhone, and I got like quizzed looks back. I contacted my network, and luckily I got through to some IT tech nerd who was quite happily talking about, about hacking and everything, but they did nothing. So even now, we're nearly, 2 years on, no one's done anything. The police have done nothing. There's no support from the government. There's no really information. The only information you find are from the likes of kind of, the antivirus, like people like Microsoft, the people that you see online, but there's nothing from a government. Nothing at all. And so even now, I don't know really, if, because I was hacked, were my elderly parents monitored? You don't know. And I think that's one of the things. So it really does. It makes you very, very paranoid, which it certainly isn't an enjoyable situation. It makes you worry about not just yourself, but people around you. And it changes the way you live and do business, because if you're trying to, in my case, help people in very dangerous situations where some very bad people would like to do harm to them if they find information, for instance, their location, or if it's a court case, the plans in that court case, that's life-changing if people get that information. And it can be, life-ending in certain circumstances. And it's terrifying that still now, certainly from my experience in England, no one in authority is taking it seriously.
David, that story. First of all, thank you so much for sharing that account with our audience. It's a really sobering story, and it's clear that you feel the reverberations even now. Stephane, let me get you to react to the story that David just shared. I mean, how common are these spyware attacks, and who's perpetrating them?
Oh, thanks for sharing this. And just reacting to the last part of the story, how come that there's nothing happening at government level in order to investigate and basically to provide for victims of this kind of attacks, redress and justice, which is what is supposed to be done by government entities. Interestingly, if you look into the ecosystem around this surveillance technologies, surveillance as a service, spyware deployment, cyber mercenaries, you call it the way you want, but it's a nexus and it's a network of very shady corporations which are, cooperating with each other, looking into research and development of this kind of malware, being financed heavily because you need some people to pour some money into this capacity for them, to grow, and they become like a central point as a service for governments when government A, B, or C has the will or ambition or strategy to spy on someone. So interestingly, you end up with private sector entities developing a capability to the point made before. When you develop capability, you develop a knowledge. Who knows where this knowledge is going to end? So to develop this knowledge that states can buy in order to spy on or other states or on specific individuals. Absolutely unacceptable. Because the other end of the problem is that who is investigating this? And it was said before, who is investigating is Amnesty Tech, this citizen lab, is civil society actors that deploy a lot of capabilities to do the job that should be done by government officials, law enforcement, to protect the citizen. And so states are more active on the policy front, at least try to be active on the policy front, saying with big statements this should not happen again. But practically speaking, operationally speaking, what is happening? And that's the key question here.
Stephane, thank you very much. And David, thank you again for sharing that story with us. I want to turn to our next example. I mentioned we were going to dive into a few real-world examples of cyber attacks. So I want to go to another example. And this one involves CEO fraud. Now, it's a phishing scam, and it's a phishing scam in which criminals impersonate corporate executives to obtain proprietary information, to obtain money. And the example that we're going to focus on today, targeted the CEO of an organization called Roots of Peace, and it became the target of this kind of scam in 2020. And I wanted to cut to a clip in which the CEO, Haigh describes that really harrowing experience.
In January 2020, I embarked with my husband on a mission to Vietnam, and we were in constant communication, of course, with our financial team. And the emails were coming in, please wish Haigh a happy birthday. We're all with her in spirit. And by the way, we need this wire transfer done, immediately. And so the bank was, making these transfers per the approval of my husband, Gary. We continued from Vietnam to China. And again, the bank notifications were, please, make this transfer to Bank of China. And we got back to our headquarters. Everybody was, so pleased. We were back and we sat down with our finance team, and it just was a ghastly moment when we all looked at each other and realized somebody was an imposter that was assuming the responsibility of the home finance team. They jumped in through the middle of the email correspondence and assumed the personality and the knowledge and the cadence of our communication. The stark realization was that the cyber attack was the equivalent of $1.34 million. And immediately then I called the FBI and said, what do we do? This wire transfer went to the Bank of China. And so they were quite helpful and introduced us to the Hong Kong police to file our complaint. When a criminal steals $1.34 million from a humanitarian nonprofit, the impact is enormous.
So Bonnie, you just heard Heidi's story, again, a really harrowing account. Now, This kind of phishing scam targeting a CEO, it could target presumably any organization, but in this case, it was a nonprofit. Why is it significant that a nonprofit was targeted in this particular instance?
So that story is harrowing, and I, have heard it before, and it is so significant for a couple of reasons. First, the financial impact. The impact to an NGO can really almost shut it down. The financial impact, losing $1.3 million could really impact just the actual operations. Can you pay your rent? Can you pay your staff? How are you going to actually keep the day-to-day operations running? The mission disruption. So there's the day-to-day operations, but then how are you going to actually complete your missions, the purpose of what you're there to do? And then if you think about, the reputation damage, because how are you going to still get donors? Because those donors might think, are you really secure? Are you running your operation properly? And are they going to continue to actually fund donations? So that's something to think about. And then if you think about the legal and regulatory consequences, I mean, we're in a very the regulatory environment is, very, it's growing, it's pervasive, it's similar to the private sector. And there is an expectation, as there should be, that you can protect the data and the resources of the NGO. So there could be fines, there could be other consequences of your inability to do so. So there could be really stark consequences of those actions.
Bonnie, thank you so much. And with that, I want to go to our third and final example. There are many other examples we could give, but a third and final example for this particular conversation. And this example, in many ways, is the most dangerous. It could have been deadly. And the example I want to discuss with all of you is the case of America's second largest healthcare system, Common Spirit Health. And last October, so October of 2022, it was targeted with a massive ransomware attack. And I want to cut to a clip of an ER nurse, Kelsey Irby, describing the experience.
My name's Kelsey Irby. I am an emergency room nurse. I work at St. Michael's Medical Center in Silverdale, Washington. So in early October of 2022, my hospital was hit with a ransomware attack that took down all of our ability to track our patients in our department. Our systems were down. We weren't able to communicate with our lab techs, with our providers. Everything was just moving very slowly. It was difficult to keep track of patients and their results, and everything had kind of ground to a halt at that point. The most concerning aspect, I think, was just not being able to see what was happening with patients. So right from the beginning, me as the charge nurse, I can't see their vitals because now all of this stuff is written down on paper. So I can't see their vitals. I can't see their triage number. So normally I can look at their labs, their history, et cetera, but I couldn't see anything else. So several patients that were coming in with chest pain. So what does that mean? Is that a heart attack? Is that they got hit in the chest with a baseball? Or they, did they pull a muscle? I don't know. So this cyber attack went on for almost 2 weeks, and eventually it was resolved and the systems kind of came back up slowly. Most of my coworkers, after our systems came back up, the primary thing that they said was that they were incredibly afraid that something terrible was going to happen to a patient. We call it a virus, and it is kind of like a virus, and we just went through a pandemic where the whole world was affected by this virus. Same thing, the whole world can be affected by a cyber attack virus as well.
Kaja, let me bring you back into this conversation. And this attack, this ransomware attack, could have had really deadly consequences. How vulnerable are hospital systems, and how, more broadly, how vulnerable are other components of critical infrastructure to these kinds of attacks?
What makes them really appealing to cyber criminals is the fact that they effectively, if you hold a hospital to ransom, they are much more likely going to pay the ransom, right? Because they are afraid that people will die, that mistakes will be made, or they as was explained in the video, that the doctors often do not know what's going on. And I think we've seen and this is actually horrendous, but during the COVID pandemic, we've seen a a massive uptake of attacks against healthcare services overall, whether it's vaccine research, whether it's hospitals more broadly. And because, criminals realize this is a sector where people care about it at the moment. It's essential to society. And unfortunately, that has not changed after the pandemic went down. It's just increased. I would say that one change that happened over the past year has been the ransomware continues, but we've seen a lot more distributed denial of service attacks against hospitals, particularly perpetrated by the different actors in Russia, Ukraine, but globally, as Stephane was talking about earlier, not just in those two countries, to drive a political point. And at the same time, hospitals, a little bit like the nonprofit sector, a lot of times, they have to prioritize funding. Often, obviously there are different models around the world, they're very frequently led by doctors or effectively, yes, by like their management is often doctors, which means that unlike, for instance, a tech company, the cybersecurity is not necessarily the thing they think about from the start, right? So bringing on board more of a technological expertise, cybersecurity expertise, and ensuring that it's part of the hospital risk management structure going forward, I think is also something that will have to happen. And a little bit like the rest of the critical infrastructure, a lot of the times they rely on older devices. Not necessarily just, we've seen lots of computer screens and computers and phones, and that's one thing. But a lot of the times you have medical devices that are being used, and they're not necessarily something that can get updated very frequently, or does get updated very frequently. The systems are not designed in the same way as sort of commercial software, so that makes them more vulnerable because you had a device, it works well for 10 years, making numbers up, but technology evolves, and in the meantime, criminals can find vulnerabilities in these devices, but you haven't been patching them, you haven't been updating them, so that also makes them more vulnerable, just because it's the whole system is much more difficult to maintain.
Thank you, Kaja. And I think that's sort of a perfect segue to the final sort of core part of our conversation. So we've given an overview of the threat landscape. We've dived into some real world examples, but obviously I think we want to end with thinking about solutions and ways forward. So we've talked about spyware, we've talked about fraud, we've talked about ransomware. So Kaja, I'm going to come back to you for this, just to kick off this part of the conversation. Based on your experience, what are some best practices? What are some best practices, and how can how can individuals, organizations, governments, how can they mitigate some of these risks?
I think that's it's always one of those questions where I feel like cybersecurity people have the same answer that has not really changed for a decade, which is implement basic cybersecurity hygiene. As we heard earlier, be careful what you click, what you download, also what you open online. Be aware what you share, what you post, what you store online. I think one of those things is always, don't post personal financial information on various social networking pages, for example. Then there are things like use multi-factor authentication. So, as you have passwords, and then you probably have a phone number, that's one example, to double check, gives an extra layer of security to your login process to make sure, and that's much harder for cyber criminals to sort of break if you have those two or even more things. Use anti-malware software that hopefully helps detect and automatically block as many attacks as possible. And I was just saying, make sure you patch whenever you get like a little notification on your computer that says you need to update the system to include a security update. Do it as soon as possible. This will help protect your work, your personal life as well. And then just assume, as much as this will sound a little paranoid, but in particular, if your organization apply what we call zero trust principle, which is assume that you either are going to be attacked or you have already been breached, and then keep verifying again and again and again that the systems are secure. I think those are like sort of a few just from both personal and sort of organizational perspective.
Thanks very much, Kaja. Stephane, let me bring you back into the conversation. So again, in the vein of best practices and solutions, tell us a little bit more about your organization. What is its mission? What are its objectives?
Thank you. And I can build upon what Kaja was mentioning in terms of what needs to be done. And sadly enough, it's not new. We know what needs to be done for quite some time. So CyberPeace Institute, we are non-for-profit based in Geneva, and we support the most vulnerable in cyberspace to do what should be done, and most importantly, to make sure that the states, the regulation, the ecosystem is transformed in a way that is provides systemic change for cybersecurity. So what we do is threefold. First, we do some hands-on, practical, operational, free cybersecurity for NGOs. We talked a lot about the NGOs. We service 180 NGOs to date. We provide them with free cybersecurity, and we leverage a network of hundreds of volunteers from the private sector to give for free what Kaja was mentioning before, implementation of password, MFA, phishing exercises, evaluation of the infrastructure of the NGO is safe, because for an NGO it's very complicated to get resources to do this. We saw the testimonial of Haigh before. And by the way, I want to commend, what she did in this context. You have someone that is heading an NGO, which is one of the last parts of the food chain in Afghanistan. This is what they do. And she has the courage to speak up, to say, okay, this happened to me. I don't want this to happen to anyone. And I would advise everyone looking into this to look into the business of what they are doing, and if they feel that it resonates, to help them. This is an amazing mission that they have. So what we do is helping these NGOs and making sure that they move from being a target to a very secure and mature cybersecurity entity. On top of this, because you can help all the NGOs on the planet, all the vulnerable communities, and you still don't change anything, we have some independent analysis of the threats. We look into big threats, the ones that are systemic to our security to hold. So we look into healthcare. So to what was mentioned before. By the way, if you look into COVID-19, when there was at some point one cyber attack per day at the worst of the pandemic, we tracked in the Institute, it's public information, you can find it, 500 of these attacks, which is nothing. It's not even the top of the iceberg. It's the ice cube on the top of the iceberg. 500 attacks lead to 5 years of cumulative disruption, during which people have access to healthcare. So that's what we do. We measure, because we think that policymaking cannot be happening without measurement, looking to the human harm of attacks, and we help the most vulnerable communities.
Stephane, thank you so much. Bonnie, I want to bring you back into the conversation. Talk to us a little bit about the Builder Initiative, and talk to us a little bit more broadly about the role that corporate volunteers can play in combating cybersecurity threats.
Sure. Well, I am very, very happy to talk to you about this, and I've been partnering with Stephane for quite some time on this. About a year ago, we introduced the Builders Initiative here at Mastercard. And Stephane talked to you a little bit about what it is, but this was really an opportunity we saw to give our employees the opportunity to use their cybersecurity skills to be a force for good. And a force for good is something that we're really proud of here at Mastercard. And it was a way for them to use their volunteer days. We get 5 volunteer days here at Mastercard, and it was a way for them to use their skills to really educate NGOs and to serve underserved communities. And it was a huge success. So we have hundreds of employees within our corporate security area, within our revenue generating businesses that have cybersecurity skills, our lawyers, throughout the company, who are engaged in missions. We call them missions. That's part of the Builders program. Whether it be doing a lot of the different types of missions that Stephane talked about, phishing campaigns, vulnerability scanning, dark web monitoring, incident response planning, doing missions around the world. And what's fantastic about it is that they can do this, virtually. They can do this, with an NGO that's in their backyard or one that's around the world. There is a very simple, user-friendly way and tool to do this. And it's really been fantastic. We've helped the Builders program to expand to different regions. We've helped them to use different tools that we have within Mastercard, RiskRecon, a company that we had acquired to help automate the program and to make the program even better. And it's great that our employees love giving back, and we believe in giving back, and we believe in skills-based volunteerism as a way to increase employee engagement and to do well. And we also believe that it's part of what we need to do to secure the overall ecosystem. So it's been a fantastic partnership and a fantastic venture.
No, that's great to hear, Bonnie. Talk to us a little bit more broadly about the role of the private sector. Talk to us a little bit more about the role of just corporations more generally in this fight.
Yeah. I mean, I think, right now, the cyber landscape is so fragmented and complex. And so it really has to be shared between the private and public sectors. There's no way that between all the information and all the threats that are out there and all the threat vectors and all the actors, the private and public sectors have to work together to share this information, to partner together, to really make the impact that has to be made, because we can't be successful. And the private sector has brought in so many more businesses and people and interactions into the digital ecosystem. So we have to help keep them secure. The public sector can't do this alone, and we have to work together for it to be successful. And that's what we believe, and that's how we've been acting and working together within the private sector. The sharing has been significant as well. So we have an important role to play in doing this. So we have to collectively defend, or we can't be successful. So I think
Bonnie,
these programs are really core to doing this.
No, thank you so much. And thank you for that work. David, let me come to you to close out this part of our conversation. Is there a human rights angle to what we've been discussing? And how do you view the mitigation of cyber threats and cyber attacks through the lens of your work, through the lens of human rights?
Certainly, I think if you look at it from a pure human rights kind of law perspective, obviously, when someone hacks you, the first thing that comes to mind is, that's a breach of your privacy, and obviously a right to a private privacy is a human right. Now, a lot of people, I'm not saying everyone, a lot of people will look at the words, a right to privacy being a human right, and perhaps not think that it's that serious. If someone, they might wrongly think, oh, well, if someone, hacks your computer and gets your picture, that's not that bad. It's not the same as being tortured or anything like that. But I think, and that's a problem, because, the way that I look at it, the right to privacy, that's it. If someone breaches your private life, that is a gateway to very, very serious breaches of other human rights, like your right to life, and right to all sorts of other things. And I think that's why, I might be wrong, but that's why I think a lot of governments and the public sector don't take things as seriously as they should. We all saw in COVID when private sector and the public sector worked together to tackle a problem that was incredibly serious about people being infected with something lethal. And yet, silently behind the scenes, we're all being affected with malware or spyware or spear phishing or whatever it is hacking, and no one's taking it that seriously. So, you've got the obvious breaches of human rights, but it's a gateway to so much worse. And, that, again, I use the word terrifying too much, but, and I don't want to misquote a fantastic Mastercard slogan, but there's some things that, you shouldn't be able to buy, and privacy is one of them. And unfortunately, at the moment, whether you're a dictator or whether you're some dodgy corporate company or a cyber mercenary, or you can buy people's privacy and with it your life, and that, I think, is such a worry, and that needs to be dealt with. And unless governments and authorities around the world start catching up, I think, with what private, it's fantastic for me as a victim of hacking to see everyone on this call, to see all the initiatives that the private sector and NGOs are doing. What's the governments around the world doing?
Well, thank you, everyone. So we're going to do sort of a quick lightning round. We've covered a lot of ground today. We looked at the general threat landscape. We've given some real-world examples of cyber attacks. We've hinted at best practices, mitigation measures. But I want to make sure just in the last few minutes that we have that we give each of you a chance to share your big takeaways with our audience. What do you want our audience to take away? What are best practices? And each of you comes at this challenge from a different sector, from a different angle. So let's do some quick lightning round takeaways. Kaja, why don't we begin with you?
Yeah, I would say the one thing that I would underline, not just from this today's panel, but also from the series, is the acknowledgement that cyber attacks have real consequences on individuals. So it's not just this massive anonymous, like, companies get hacked and they rich enough they can pay money, but like actual real people get impacted. And I think those have been some of them. I feel for me really Stephane was also saying across the board, I think all the people who spoke up were very brave, and it's really important. But it is really important that we are transparent and that we talk about the impact this has on individuals' lives, not just the monetary value, the reputations, but also on the impact on psychology, the impact on how you then interact with the online world. I think that's a really important point. And also, as we talked a lot about various vulnerable sectors, I think, as we look at, either human rights activists, or we look at organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, or even the International Criminal Court, I think was hacked last month. These are all organizations that are doing, they're trying to defend peace and stability. They're trying to advocate for all of our human rights. And the fact that the fact that governments in particular, not just cyber criminals, and obviously not all governments, abuse the systems, buy these products and tools to go after these groups, it's something we should take a stance against, to the point of what the governments are doing. I think governments need to adopt for themselves, but also for other governments around the world, sets of rules that would prevent them from doing that. Of course, there will also be cheaters, but I think actually making a stand is really important at this stage of time.
Kaja, thank you. Bonnie, closing thoughts from you.
Two closing thoughts, especially if there are folks from the private sector who are watching this. The first is skills-based volunteerism can be a win-win. We've seen that here. Our data proves it, that people who are volunteering in the Builders program and are using their skills, we have data that they are more engaged. They're more engaged in their work here at Mastercard. They are more engaged in the work that they do for us every day. It's a win-win. It benefits us, it benefits the ecosystem, and it benefits the specific NGOs. So get involved in programs like that. And then on a more macro level for corporations, it is a shared responsibility. So you and your organizations get involved. If you're not already involved, get involved, on a policy level. If your policy organizations aren't already involved, you need to be getting involved.
Thank you, Bonnie. David.
I think, speaking from a perspective as a victim or from a human rights lawyer, I think one of the first things is, be aware of what can be done or is being done to you. Be prepared for that. Be safe. So, the things we've all discussed. And I think another important thing is that, certainly from more of a grassroots level and in communities, educate people. We've all got vulnerable people and elderly people looking at individuals who, like certainly for myself, when my parents get a text message saying there's an Amazon parcel, click here, and they've never used Amazon in their life, make sure that those people know not to click on there. And I think another important thing which people are not doing enough is that we need to bite back against the people that are doing this. So don't just ignore that text message. Obviously, don't click on it. but report it to the authorities, report it to the police, report it to Amazon, and keep doing that. And if we can spread that knowledge, as far and wide as possible, then that's a way of taking the fight back to the people that are hacking us. And I think that's one of the things to do, because I look at it from the level of communities and going up. And I think those are all important things.
David, thank you so much. Stephane, you get the last word.
Thank you so much. I would say as an opening word that we should not let cybercrime and cyber attacks become the new acceptable tax of the internet. Like, I remember an internet when there was no publicity. It was very nice. It disappeared. And there was an internet without spam. It was nice. It disappeared. And now there's an internet with a lot of cyber attacks, a lot of cybercrime. And we have the tendency to become, okay, so what? That's just the way it is. We cannot accept this because the price that we're going to pay is way too high. And then if we think about steps to get out of this, they are quite simple. This is 3 simple steps. It's about accountability, accountability, and accountability. At the end of the day, government, and we talked about this quite a lot, are responsible to put regulations in place, framework to limit the space of criminal groups or of whatever rogue actors is out there. That's what about policymaking is. So we do our part, like civil society, corporation, we provide data, we provide for free help. Us, CyberPeace Institute, we measure for free, publicly, what is happening for big threats, invasion 2022 of Ukraine, what is happening on healthcare, providing data when the most vulnerable are impacted. But at the end of the day, accountability is on government side. And there's, I want also to exit this legend that there's no law in cyberspace, because there's a lot of legal framework that today could be applicable. But where is the accountability on application of this framework to protect the most vulnerable in cyberspace? And I will finish on this.
Stephane, thank you very much. And that wraps up our conversation on a very important issue. I think we covered a lot of ground today, giving a sense of the threat landscape, discussing particular examples of cyber attacks, and concluding by pointing the way towards potential solutions. And so I want to thank all of our esteemed panelists. So let me reintroduce them. Kaja Ciglic, Senior Director of Digital Diplomacy at Microsoft, Stephane Duguin, CEO of the CyberPeace Institute, Bonnie Leff, Senior Vice President of Corporate Security at Mastercard, and David Haigh, a human rights attorney. I want to thank all of them, and I want to thank all of the individuals who shared their experiences with the audience through their videos today. And so with that, to see all of the content in this series, to learn more about the organizations that are doing important work in this space that we've highlighted during today's conversation, head over to gzeromedia.com/global stage, click on the Caught in the Digital Crosshairs series to learn more. I'm Ali Wyne with Eurasia Group. Thanks very much for watching and have a great day.